Well, welcome back to the virtual town hall for TuckerAllen. I'm Scott Trout, and I'll be the moderator for today. We're going to be talking about estate planning and blended families. And always keep in mind that we don't want to give legal advice, and this is really educational, informational. And no attorney-client relationship. We'd love to have you come in for a consultation. You can do that by going to the website at TuckerAllen.com, and you can schedule a consultation right there. If you have questions you want answered, you can submit those now in the chat box or the Q&A section, and we'll get to those here at the end of our virtual town hall today, in about 30 minutes of time. Also, if you want questions answered in future town halls, you could submit those to TuckerAllen.com/questions. You can give us a call also at 866-335-3375 and schedule that consultation. Love to have sit down and go through your particular estate planning needs and give you a good strategy and direction. So today we're once again joined by two repeat guests from TuckerAllen at opposite ends of the state. We've got Teresa Yao in Edwardsville, Illinois. Welcome.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for joining. And then up in Kansas City area, we've got Kevin Mason. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for having me today.
So today, again, we're going to talk a little bit about something I think we alluded to in our Facebook Live segment, and we've talked a little bit about this. And again, we're going to be always on Fridays. If you haven't tuned in on Fridays at 1 o'clock Central Time, 15 minutes, tune into Facebook or TuckerAllen's webpage. We spend 15 minutes just on real short topics. Love to see you there. And we also answer questions that are submitted at TuckerAllen Live on Facebook. Also, check out the website. It's got full of information, including the Elder Law podcast and the radio show that happens. We would love to have you here on that as well. So we're going to get right to the blended families topic right after this very quick, brief break.
I wasn't really avoiding it, but I'm pretty good at procrastinating. I needed a trust. When I found TuckerAllen, all our questions were answered, all of our fears allayed.
You want your wishes in place, so there's no guessing, no stress on the children.
Basically, they talk about what you need, what's important to you. It was more conversational, really very simple.
All right, well, welcome back. Let's get right into it. So we have the next 25 minutes to talk about this and answer a question or two. Again, if you have questions, you can submit those in the Q&A section as well in the chat box. We'll get right to those at the end of the segment here in about 25 minutes. So Teresa, the topic is blended families and estate planning. We can all probably try to figure out what that means, but why don't you break it down and tell everyone, what does blended family and how common is it?
Sure. So just the broadest definition, I think, for blended families is when people come in, it's a couple, and they had prior marriages or they have kids from prior relationships. And essentially they're coming together and there's just children from both sides or from one side of a relationship, and that they're trying to create an estate plan together, trying to kind of put all the pieces and make sure it works for everyone.
And it could be children of any age, right? It could be old, young, whatever it may be. Or is it possible when we say blended family, I guess we could be meaning, albeit they don't have children, and they're considered a family unit. It could be just second marriages, which they may have cousins or nieces or nephews, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's just saying that, hey, they don't have like the common kids, like mutual biological kids or adopted, that they have like very straightforward interests for. It's just saying, hey, both parties have their people to take care of.
Yeah. And it's so important when we talk about blended families, second marriages, third marriages, whatever it is, subsequent marriage, when you do bring in kids, to really revisit your estate planning. I was just having a lunch yesterday and we talked about the need for continually revisiting your estate plan, and it assumes you have one. Obviously, if you don't, it's something to be considered, making sure it's up to date and meets the needs, not only what you're thinking about, but perhaps what you're not. That's really what's critical and important. Kevin, we really want to question is how common is it? There's an article from the Hook Law Center, and we can talk a little bit about that and where you're getting some data here. How common is this blended family where they come in the door, or you need to reach out to them and have an estate plan drawn?
Sure. So I would say that it is increasingly common, as there's some trends kind of related to divorce that are causing this to be more common. And I'm going to have to look down at my notes to read some of this to you because I don't have all of the data memorized. but I'm just going to run through some of it real quick and just to give you an idea about this. So
Great.
approximately 50% of marriages here in the USA end in divorce, and then approximately 60% of remarriages end in divorce. Let's see here, approximately 43% of marriages are remarriages for at least one of the parties. So that's kind of right in there what we're talking about. And then each year there's approximately 1.16 million new divorces. So these are some big numbers that we're talking about here. Approximately 54% of divorced women remarry within 5 years. So these are all reasons why we see more and more blended families here as time goes on.
In that article, I mean, I always try to relate when we're talking in these town halls to personal experience, and we think about it. When we started this, I didn't even think about this example, but I've got someone I know where their father got remarried. It was her first marriage, but his second. And so she brought in kids, basically, that were young and old, and he had kids. He passes away, and they wound up not having revised the estate plan to ensure that his kids were taken care of. Now there's this huge argument about who's inheriting and who's getting what and who's taking it, and it becomes almost to the extent that you have some children being disinherited. Do you see that as a problem that occurs, and one of the reasons that this should be, a priority for people?
Yes, absolutely. So I had read another article here recently, and I can't remember exactly the number, what it was, or how they had really gotten this data, but it was a huge percentage of the time that in like a blended family type of situation where the first spouse to pass away, their children that have come into this new blended family are disinherited. It was well over 50% of the time. And obviously, that's not the case for every blended family. There's some blended families who aren't going to have any problems whatsoever. But, Teresa and I's job is we can't think of the best case scenario, unfortunately. Whenever we're doing our work, we have to kind of think of the worst case scenario and plan for all the contingencies. So that's kind of why we have to be thinking of these things. And we don't want somebody to be disinherited. What we want to do is we want to follow out the client's wishes. And if the client doesn't wish for somebody to be disinherited, then the last thing we would want is for that to occur at some point.
I mean, it's like a prenuptial or premarital agreement. No one wants to really think about their estate plan when they're getting remarried. I mean, it's, you're a happy time, and sometimes you're talking about death, and no one wants to talk about it. But, COVID has taught us a lesson that's probably a priority. But that example I gave, this Hook Law Center article, it really has some really interesting scenarios. And one of them, the first one, is kind of the one I just talked about, where you have two people get married, both bringing kids in. Husband dies, who's a father, let's just say my friend, and all of his assets go to his current wife. She then prepares her own will and writes all of his kids out of it. And now they've got nothing. I mean, that's like the nightmare scenario for kids, right?
Yes, and I think that's like an all too common situation that occurs. And it's just due to kind of a lack of proper planning and a lack of wanting to have these kind of tougher conversations there at the beginning to, people don't generally like to rock the boat, especially with their spouse. And this could cause some tougher questions, but that's kind of where Teresa and I can step in and make things a little bit easier for the clients by saying, hey, we see the situation you guys are in. Here are some of the data that's out there that this is what occurs generally speaking. And then that way we can kind of take it off to the client and say, here's what we can suggest for you guys as a blended family. Here's maybe something that would work well for you all in your situation, and the situation is different in each blended family. Yeah. So, we would have to know a lot more specifics, but then that way we can kind of take it off of the client that's walking through the door saying, I'm worried that my spouse, whenever I pass away, is going to disinherit my children. Whereas Teresa and I can say, hey, this is something that happens, and we want to prepare. We don't want that to happen because you don't want that to happen. So how do we prepare for this? And we can kind of take some of it off of them. Yeah,
I mean, even long-term care, that's a big concern that, you may be the same age, but we all have, as we go into a second marriage, perhaps, let's say I want to make sure my kids are taken care of. But I'm concerned that my new husband may, have to, we spend all of our money on his care. That's something I imagine you and Teresa could handle. And really in a manner it's a delicate, right, conversation about, hey, we want to make sure your kids are taken care of. I want to make sure my kids are taken care of. Let's figure out a way to both pay for our long-term care and be able to provide something for our kids. Is that you can be very specific. We've been talking about that for a long time in these virtual town halls about provisions in trust, not just a simple will that could address that concern.
Sure. Yes. Whenever we're talking about blended families and kind of the tools that we can use for them, whether it's like what you were just speaking about, kind of the fear of the cost of long-term care, or really just kind of that fear of somebody being disinherited, the tools that we're going to utilize, we're not going to use a will. We're going to have to use a trust just because they are so much, they're more modifiable. They just allow us to do so much more than a simple will does.
Yeah. So Teresa, that obviously kind of what we've been talking about, I know this is important and requires really a special consideration when we talk about all those particular problems I just raised, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think especially for blended families, I mean, families already are like differ so much from each other, but especially for blended families, I think baseline, it's like really important to know that your plan will most likely require a lot of customization. And in terms of if there are kids involved, whether they're adult or minor kids, most of the time when blended families come together, the other parent doesn't actually adopt the other kids. And then so they're just stepkids, and technically they're not descendants, right? Adoption makes them legally your descendants, but if they're just your stepkids, they're kind of left out of the picture if you don't kind of work on being proactive about creating an estate plan to help take care of them too, if that's your wish.
Mm-hmm. It's so easy. As Kevin pointed out, we have 50 to 51% of all marriages end in divorce, and we have subsequent number of remarriages, seconds and thirds. And we hammer home this message of, hey, get your planning done, get your planning done, get your planning done. And they may go get a simple will, or they may have it already done, or they may go in and not talk to their attorney about, hey, this is our second marriage, because they don't know. And they don't know to point that out because they're not thinking about the potential obstacles. But what about, the issue where you have maybe some contention or contentious relationships among a step parent and the other kids? Is that always something that pops up as well?
Yeah, I mean, when blended families come up and it's not, a hunky-dory blended family, which is, common, it's expected, especially if it's adult children coming together. It's not like the minor kids grew up with this step parent. There might be tension between the step parent and the step kids, and the kind of biological parent of those kids kind of want to make sure, how do you balance your interests in terms of taking care of your spouse, but also making sure your kids don't feel left out, that you're not just giving everything to the spouse when there's this tension between the kids and that new, step parent.
Yeah. I mean, I encourage people, check it out. It's a really interesting article, hooklawcenter.com. It talks about what blended families should know about estate planning. Really great scenarios that you may not be thinking about because you're so focused on taking the steps that we talk about and advocate for constantly. So obviously, if you have questions, submit them now. Q&A in the chat section. We'll get to those. Kevin, Robinson and Henry out of Colorado has a good article that talks about utilizing joint pour-over trusts for blended families. Talk a little bit about that if you can.
Sure. So before I hop into that, I just wanted to toss out one more quick scenario that I think is kind of common that people should be watching out for. Is sometimes whenever we have a blended family situation, one of the spouses might be, significantly older than the spouse that they are remarrying now. And that can create an issue, right, where there's a long delay maybe for the children of that older spouse to be able to inherit. So that's just also something that we want to think about. And maybe we could, we can make some plans to work around that or work with that. So the joint pour over trust idea here. So the kind of the broad idea of this is that we're going to create multiple trusts as for this estate plan. So instead of just having the one trust, we're going to create multiple trusts here. So because we're going to assume that each spouse is coming into the marriage with some of their own assets that they've had prior to the marriage. And we want to keep those, we want to kind of keep them separate. And in that way, the children of the spouse, they get to inherit those assets that were brought into the marriage by their parent. Instead of creating it as like marital property, if, you know, just kind of, I guess, depending on where you are, right? But we don't want those assets to get mixed as the goal. Is that we kind of want to keep the assets separate, and then that way, as it gets inherited, there's no question kind of who it came from and why it's going there.
Yeah, it just came to mind. I'm thinking here we're talking about second marriages, maybe for both, but it's possible where you may have a son who gets married to, you know, his wife who had children outside of marriage, and they're bringing in children, or you both are. I mean, it's, I guess we talk about divorce and remarriage, but it could be just, again, the blended family could be anything you're thinking about, adoption, just something in which you enter into a new relationship, a formal marriage, or whatever it may be, in which you need to protect, you know, children or protect your wishes or your needs. And again, that's the whole point of scheduling a consultation. And let's talk broadly and figure out and dig and be creative. And that's huge. So, Teresa, there's, you know, all types of strategies that you can employ. Spendthrift trust or spray spendthrift trust. What is that? And talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, so that's a unique provisions that can be built into like your own your own revocable trust. A spray trust, sometimes it's called a sprinkling trust, is essentially a trust where you leave a ton of discretion to the trustee. You're not saying that, hey, it's going to be equal to all these beneficiaries. You're saying, hey, trustee, you can hold everything in here and you decide what you think is equitable. So normally this is somebody that you immensely trust and shares the same kind of thought processes and priorities as you, or you can kind of provide some direction to like a corporate trustee, somebody who can be more objective in the situation that you trust that they will be objective in divvying out assets to spouse, to beneficiaries, to spouse, to kids, whoever the beneficiaries may be. In terms of a spendthrift trust, like a sprinkling spendthrift trust, that just adds an extra layer, an extra provision that's saying, hey, anything we give to the beneficiaries, it must be protected. The beneficiaries can't actually access the principal or the stuff inside the trust. There's a separate trustee that manages that for the beneficiary so that there can be limitations on which the beneficiary can actually ask for the funds from the trust. And also it just protects those assets from any creditors for the beneficiary. So for example, if you have a child or a stepchild that you kind of are more concerned with in terms of having addiction issues or having money problems, or if they're going through a divorce, a spendthrift trust allows their assets that you leave to them to be protected instead of, you know, just kind of giving it to them and letting it be spent. And
that may be, I think, valuable for any number of scenarios. Yeah, I mean, you could have it just with generally an immature child or stepchild
Absolutely.
Or whatever it may be, that they get a windfall of money, they won't know how to manage it appropriately. And I think it's about, you know, talking about what do you wish and talking about, hey, I'm going to do this and it'll take care of you. You don't have to worry about managing this money and you're still going to have access to it under these circumstances, or you have to go make it contingent on getting a 4-year degree, something like that, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. This actually applies, I think, not just for blended families, but for almost all families that are interested in kind of regulating more of how the trust funds can be used.
What about bloodline trusts? What is that?
Yeah, so bloodline trust kind of applies to more blended families where it's not so much about the people creating the trust, but maybe one of their kids has a spouse, like your daughter-in-law or your son-in-law that you really don't like. For whatever reason, maybe the daughter-in-law or son-in-law is really bad at money, can't hold down a job or whatnot. And you want to make sure that whatever you leave to your kids is not just going to be squandered by their spouse. So a bloodline trust is essentially developing distributions in the trust so that it only goes to your kid. The spouse cannot access it. And that if something happens to your kid, it doesn't go to their spouse. It goes to your grandkids, the kids of that kid. So a bloodline trust just makes sure that assets are kind of protected within the bloodline.
Yeah. Similarly, Kevin, I've always heard, the ILIT, the Irrevocable Life Insurance Trust, where I think you put the proceeds or the actual life insurance in a trust, and talk about how that can assist families with blended families, or generally, whether you've got it anyway, whether it's a good estate planning tool.
Sure. So it's a great estate planning tool. So it can be very helpful in like the blended family situation, or a situation maybe where we're thinking about some asset protection. But today, speaking towards like the blended family situation, that scenario that I kind of brought up a minute ago, where we have one spouse is much older than the spouse that they are now marrying. And so the odds are, right, that they're going to die much sooner than the other spouse, and then their children have to wait around a long time to get any sort of inheritance. If you utilize, an ILIT, then what can happen is that this person passes away, and they make their children the beneficiary for their ILIT, or partial beneficiaries for the ILIT, and then they get that distribution right away and don't really have to wait around for the step parent, that spouse, to pass away to get any sort of inheritance. So it's a great tool to kind of utilize in addition to like that joint pour over trust, or any of the trusts that Teresa was talking about. Or there's another type of trust called a spousal lifetime access trust that's very similar to that like joint pour over trust. So it's just a great additional tool to kind of tack on for a lot of these situations.
So, Teresa, I'm just kind of scrolling through this article and just trying to get some of the interesting topics. Life estates, what is that?
So life estates is actually really helpful if, for example, you get married, it's a second marriage or subsequent marriage, and you live together in a home, and you want to make sure, let's say the home is just in your name because you had it prior to the second marriage, and you want to make sure that your spouse can continue living in that house, but you want to make sure that at the end of the day, the home sale proceeds go to your kids. So a life estate can be utilized to say, hey, when I pass, my spouse will have a life estate in this property, or this life interest, which means while your spouse is alive, she or he will have the priority in getting to use it. And then you can build contingencies on it too, saying, hey, he or she can only have the life estate if they're the ones managing the property taxes, paying all the kind of utility bills and everything. And then after the spouse passes away, then it reverts back to quote unquote your original estate that can then be passed to your kids.
That seems like an amazing tool, especially, if you want to make sure you've had that conversation. I want my property. I come into the marriage with a house, right? I want them to have it, but I don't want to deprive my spouse of living in it, as you suggest. I think that's an amazing tool that probably typical estate plans don't even think about as you're going through it. So I think it's a really good point, and encourage people to look up and more about life estates. Qualified terminable interest property trust. That's a mouthful.
That
Q-tips.
Is a huge mouthful.
What is that?
It's Q-tip for short. That kind of shortens it up. But it's essentially a type of trust that you can create. And it's saying that, hey, after I pass away, all these assets inside of this trust, it'll still end up going to my kids, my original beneficiaries. But in the meantime, my spouse gets the income interest from the trust, so that any income generated within the trust, it will be continue to serve the spouse while he or she is alive. After he or she passes, then the trust principal, or the stuff inside of that trust, can then be distributed to whoever you designate as your beneficiaries.
Are there estate tax issues, perhaps?
Yeah,
with that?
it's actually pretty beneficial in terms of if there is a estate tax that will be applied by having the spouse take on the income interest while he or she is still living. That tax can actually be deferred until the passing of the second spouse.
Oh, okay. Kevin, disclaimer trusts. What is that?
Sure. So this is a type of trust that oftentimes is created by a will. So there will be a provision in the person's will that creates this trust, and upon their death, it gets created. And then what can happen is that some of their assets are going to get moved by the surviving spouse into this trust. And then within this trust, like we talk about all the time, that these trusts are so customizable, then within this trust that's being created by the will that assets are being moved into, we can have a lot of customization that goes on inside of that to say, there's minor children out there that we're thinking of with this trust, or maybe we use it to help create a different type of trust that allows the spouse, access to some of the income and then a little bit of the principal of the asset that gets moved into the trust for their lifetime. So, in that way, we get to keep the surviving spouse. We do everything that we can to maintain their quality of life that they were enjoying while their spouse was alive. But then at the same time, we're making sure that they don't have access to everything, in which they could, they could kind of run through the money, or maybe they have access to everything. So like we had talked about earlier, they create a new estate plan that kind of leaves out some of the children. So this way it's kind of irrevocable. We can still give this surviving spouse, give them some income, maybe give them access to a little bit of the principal, but in that way we're still holding on to some of these trust assets, making sure that they're going to be there for the children.
So there's an article, I don't know if either of you had a chance to look at it. It's by Forbes. The author or contributor was Christine Fletcher. It's titled 6 Estate Planning Tips for Blended Families. Either of you get a chance to peek at that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good article, because I think anybody should read it, especially if you're getting ready to schedule a consultation with your attorney. And before you get there, because then you can have a conversation about it. Again, it's Forbes.com. You can search it, probably 6 estate planning tips for blended families. I think it's a really good article, just really simple, kind of hits some of the highlights here. And particularly one, I think, Teresa, you were mentioning, let me see here, was talking about hiring an experienced and sophisticated trustee. I think you mentioned that, right?
Yeah, because with blended families, especially, it's fertile ground for contentious family relationships. And then when you have that as a possibility, and you never know what might come out of the woodwork later, it might be a great family dynamic while you're still around. It's just, if you really want to be safe, it might be better to have a sophisticated trustee that knows how to manage these relationships, and also is the objective source in terms of providing distribution, so that in terms of the person kind of holding the wallet for the trust, it's not somebody who has a vested interest in the pot itself too.
And one thing I'm curious, both of your thoughts here, in the article mentions, and I didn't even think about this, in a blended family or a second marriage, making healthcare decisions. It's got to be a hugely, very difficult conversation, because someone, if it's contentious with, let's say, a stepchild and a stepmom, and you don't want her making the decisions for your father, that's a conversation that parents should have and say, okay, who should really be making these decisions? That's a great point about blended families, don't you both think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I think with the healthcare, I think it's also important to keep in mind, though, your healthcare power of attorney is for you. Ultimately, you have to decide who you think is actually the best person suited for that situation. And I don't know, this kind of requires a little more savvy and kind of doing the work ahead of time before they're in that position to make those decisions. Maybe you have that conversation with your kids if you appointed your new spouse as your first choice healthcare power of attorney, and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know I set it up this way. It's your time to voice your justification for setting it up too.
Yeah.
But I think the most important thing is, this is your document. It's your health. It's your body. So you still got to do what's right for you.
Yep. So the one question we had that's submitted, I'm going to open it to both of you, and just you can comment as we wrap up today. And Teresa, you can kind of give us your closing thoughts as well. But let me just go to you first, Teresa, and you can kind of throw in your closing thoughts in general. The question was, with both spouses bringing individual assets into the new marriage, obviously that's a blended family, do you have a recommendation on how to plan for passing of assets to children if both spouses die early in their marriage versus way down the road 20 years later?
Yeah, so right now in this hypothetical, I'm thinking, because of the 20 years down the road, I'm thinking it's a relatively young family. If the kids are minor, and you want to make sure whenever you have minor kids, please have an estate plan set up, because you really want to make sure that goes to the correct guardians should something happen to both of you. And also in terms of leaving assets behind, you probably have a lot more strings attached than if your kids are 40, 50 years old, right? Because you don't know what they're going to be like as adults. So you might want to set up distributions through a trust to be more incremental in nature so that the kids can get support, but they don't get one huge lump sum up all at once. So when you're younger and if something happens to both of you, that estate plan will probably look a lot different than 20 years down the road if something happens to the two of you. Maybe your kids are adults. Maybe it's okay to set up distribution so everything goes outright to each child.
Yeah.
It really depends. I think the main takeaway here is a very different situation depending on where you are in your marriage and where you are in your family timeline. And it's really important to create one early and maintain it too.
Yep. Kevin, any or either of you have any closing thoughts as we wrap up today's virtual town hall?
I think I have one last closing thought. I think with the topic of blended families, I know we always say, hey, no matter what situation you're in, it's always a good idea just to come and talk to us and see, maybe we'll bring up questions that you've never thought of, but especially if you're in a blended family situation, chances are it will help you a lot more to speak with an attorney and to kind of get what each of your priorities are, even if it's just to have the conversation of saying, hey, now that we're two families coming together, it's pretty common for people to update their estate plans. Have an attorney do that hard, difficult conversation for you saying, hey, I know it's a little awkward, but this is really important. And it's actually really common for people to update it under these circumstances.
And do some homework, do some research, go to these articles and then take those into the attorney. And, they think, as I said, it should be a simple process, one which we want to do exactly what you want to do. And we'll guide you and remind you of the things that maybe you're forgetting. And so I think that's great. So Kevin and Teresa, as always, thanks for your valuable input and joining today in the virtual town hall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So go to TuckerAllen.com. It is full of resources just like this. You can check out all of our previous virtual town halls as well for spot topics. Go to the website or go to Facebook and you can see our Facebook Live that we do on Fridays. And if not, tune in tomorrow. Love to see you at 1 o'clock Central Time, 15 minutes, real quick topic. You can log in, ask questions live, and get answers right there on Facebook as well. And also look for the next virtual town hall coming up in May. Love to have you join us again. And we'll talk a little bit about a few topics and get your questions answered just like today. So you can give us a call at 866-335-3375, offices in the Kansas City area, St. Louis area, and Edwardsville, Illinois. So until next time, we'll see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock Central Time, and then I'll see you next month at our virtual town hall.